So in the previous episode, we got all of our general settings working for our config menu. Now let's get the audio settings working, and all we need to do is change the volume leveling and the mute setting of the different mixers down here, which represent the different audio channels that we can use here for music, sound effects, and voices. Now, when we're working with audio, let's go ahead and load this up. And let's try to just change the volume directly within the audio mixer. So actually, I need to get that off of the screen. Let me go ahead and take root, where are you? Right there, and hide it. So, here we are, let's get to the part where we have music rolling in the background. I'm going to set that to play focused so I can get it minimized and running, and now let's look at the main mixer. So the music, if I go ahead and edit in play mode, then I can change the volume here. You can see that the volume is starting at 0. If you look at an audio source in the screen, then what you would have is a volume that is running at from 0 to 1. So let's look at our audio manager, look in channel 0 or channel 1, which has the music, and we can see that our volume is 0.4 of 1. So we can raise that up and we can take it down and we can fade in the audio smoothly. However, with an audio mixer, it doesn't quite work that way, because the audio is just basically rendering in decibels, which you can see right here represented as dB. So 0 does not mean it's silent. That is just the default. So that's basically like 1. And if we were to raise this up, then you can see that we can raise the volume up a little louder. And if we drag it down, we can fade it out. And it goes all the way down to -80, which is the silent point. But if we go from 0, then we can see the halfway point is basically silent. So we're definitely not going to run on a normalized value here. We're going to need to set this based off of a normalized value, and then run that through an animation curve where we can control the volume drop-off on a very gradual pace that will sound smooth and sound natural. So that way, setting it to 0.5 on the volume will actually set this to half volume, which would be somewhere around -13 or what have you. We'll play around with it, but that's basically the gist of what we need to do here to get proper audio leveling. So that means our config menu is going to need something special here. We're going to need what's called an animation curve. So we can go ahead and say serialize field private animation curve. An animation curve will basically allow us to create different points on a graph where we can set the different points where the audio is going to be fading lower and lower and lower. So this will be the audio fall off curve. Now, we can do that here, but to me it would make more sense if we had this available to us on the actual audio manager. Because if we set this on our config menu, then we're just going to have access to our config menu and we won't really be able to change mixers from anything else. Granted, that's pretty much all we're going to be doing here, is just changing the volume from the mixers, but you never know, just in case, we may wind up wanting to do that in some other manner that may not be related to the config menu, especially if we don't have a config menu. So we can go ahead and set this in our audio manager and keep the logic with itself and provide that to anything that wants to change volume just by accessing it directly through the audio manager. So our audio manager is going to be restricted to one instance in the scene, and we can access that to get this curve. So below our mixers, we're going to go ahead and add that back in, but if we want it to be accessible, let's make it public. If you wanted to protect this, you could set it as a private variable and just have a public getter for it, but I'm just going to go ahead and make it public because I know what I'm doing and I'm the only one working on this project. And that means if we look at our audio manager in the scene, now we have an audio fall-off curve, which is blank. So we could choose one of the defaults here, and that would take us from a setting going from 0 all the way to 1 on a normalized scale. So normalized 0 to 1 on the X, 0 to 1 on the Y. Now that's not exactly what we want for our audio bar. So our slider is going to be 0 to 1, but the actual audio mixer that we're going to be changing is that 0 to -80. So right off the bat, we know that we need to change this 0. Let's go ahead and edit the key, and then keep the time the same, because the time is basically the position of the slider bar on our UI. If we have it at 1, then it's going to be at time 1 and whatever the value is. If we're at time 0, then we'll be at whatever this value is. That value is going to be -80, because that is the bottom of our little audio mixer level. So that's real small and not something that we can really edit easily. So if you hold Control and then scroll up your mouse wheel, then you can just zoom in along the x-axis. And now we can get a better look at our audio curve and edit this thing to our liking. Okay, so I've gone ahead and configured a couple points here. The first one is still time 0 at value -80. The second point that I've placed in is right here. If we look at this point, at 0.25, I'm basically separating this into fourths. At 0.25, we are at value -25, which is essentially 25% volume. Now, if we go to halfway in the middle, we're at -10, which is, to my ear, about half volume. And of course, all the way at the top, we see time 1, value 0, which is the default value. You might need to play around with the curves here to make sure you get the right sound, such as I want it to very, very slightly decrease and then drop off rapidly towards the very end, because there's such a negligible difference in the audio at that point. So if we have this line here, then we can use that to set the actual volume of the mixer. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's make the mixers available to our config menu, and let's set them through our sliders. To do this, I'm going to copy the set text architect speed, because it's basically just using a slider and then setting some sort of value. And I'll paste that and then set music volume. So this will set the music volume, and I'll say config.music volume equals UI.musicvolume.value. But we do need to change how we're going to set that on the audio mixer. Okay, so we'll go ahead and set the value on the slider to the music volume of whatever we've gotten. We'll set our config to whatever we've got the slider set to. And then we'll go ahead and apply it in our audio setting, but let me go ahead and grab, let's duplicate this for our sound effects, and duplicate for our voices, which I want to spell with a C for some reason. Now config sfx volume equals UI.sfx volume, and voice volume is UI.voices volume. So how do we set the volume on those different mixers? Well, to do that, we need to expose the volume parameters on these different mixer groups. So on the music mixer, we can see that we have exposed parameters here, which is actually for the main mixer. So if we expose a parameter for music, it's then available from the main mixer, and the same for SFX and voices. But to do that, let's click on the one that we want, and let's go over to the volume tab, right-click on it, and expose volume of music. Now you can see we have an exposed parameter called myExposedParam, and it shows what it belongs to, the volume of the music group. Now, if we go ahead and right-click and rename this, we can call this music volume. And we can do the same thing for SFX, so expose that, and expose voices, and then look at these. myExposedParam1 is volume of SFX, so rename SFX volume. And then expose param1, rename to voices volume. What that then allows us to do is access those values through the audio manager. And so we can go ahead and grab the mixer that we're looking for. So audio mixer group, this will be the mixer, which will equal the audio manager dot instance dot music mixer. And we're going to go ahead and get the audio curve as well. So animation curve, audio fall off equals audio manager dot instance dot fall off curve. And now let's go ahead and set the volume. So mixer dot audio mixer, because the music mixer is the group which is not going to have access to the exposed parameter, but the audio mixer does. The audio mixer is the master mixer, which this mixer is a child of. That would be the main mixer. So we essentially grab music and we look for master, and from master we have a list of the exposed parameters. So we grab the audio mixer, and now let's call the function. Since our volume is a float, we'll say set float to set the value. And we're going to set a float called some sort of value. I think we'll go back to the audio manager and we'll make a couple constants. So public constant music volume parameter name equals music volume. Constant full string. It needs to be a string. So I'll go ahead and just duplicate that 3 times, change that to SFX, and change that to SFX volume, and then voices volume as well. So voices volume will be voices volume. Just making sure that we match that up exactly with what we have here in the exposed parameters, because we need to access them by name. So when we do that, we can set the float of audio manager dot music volume parameter name. I think, yeah. And then we'll go with the audio fall off, which is the curve, and we need to evaluate what our time is, which would be in our slider value. So evaluate the curve, and we will evaluate it based off of the config.music volume, which has been assigned from the slider value. And we can basically just copy that and paste it in our other functions here for SFX and voices, just making sure that for SFX we get the SFX mixer, and we set the float of the SFX volume parameter name, config.sfx volume as the slider value. Do the same thing for the voices, so we get the voices mixer, and set float voices volume parameter name, audio falloff evaluate config.voices volume, and then we'll go ahead and smoothly change the volume of these different audio mixers. From our VN configuration, we need to make sure that we apply this as well. So after we set the architect speed, then let's set the audio mixer volumes. Now when we set the on value changed for the sliders, in order for them to call those functions we just made, they will actually be called when we change the value from script as well, which is really what we want. So we can just go ahead and say ui.musicvolume.value equals the music volume, and that will change the value, and it will automatically call the function that is on that slider. If for some reason you didn't want to do that, then instead of assigning value directly, you could say set value without notify, and then it would not trigger the event that is on that value changed action, whatever you call it. So we go ahead and do our music volume, our SFX as well, so SFX and then voices, and just change that to SFX volume and voices volume. So then what we can do is grab our slider from the music, slider from SFX, and from voices, come down to on value changed, add a new event, and then make sure our config menu is set. Go to config menu, and then set music volume. So that's good for the music. Let's go to sound effects and just change from set music to set sound effects. And for voices, change set music to set voices volume. And now we should be able to go through here and watch it change. All right, so if I go to config, let me go see audio, change, yep, okay, cool. So you can see down halfway, that sounds about half volume, 75%, full 100, 75, halfway, about 25% pretty low, and then of course down where you can't even hear it. This might need some tweaking, but for my ears that sounds about right. Don't know if there's an actual formula for this, but seems to work pretty well. Now, one thing we got to do is, now that we have control of the audio mixer volumes, let me go ahead and just change these, and let's reload, and the values should go ahead and reapply on reload. Let's go ahead and check. As soon as it loads the configuration, yep, those volumes get set back to where they were. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this. And before I forget, let me go ahead and select my scroll view here and change from elastic to clamped on audio and general. So that way I can't just drag them around like you saw me do a second ago. If we go back in and look at config, I can no longer drag this around because it is indeed clamped. Okay, so what we need to do now is set the mute capability by clicking these buttons. So we should change this audio symbol to a muted symbol and effectively mute our audio mixer. So let's go ahead and make the functions that will be called when we click those buttons. So public void set music mute and bool mute. We can do the same thing for sound effects and voices. So set sound effects mute and set voices mute. Now what we'll do here is we'll access config.musicMute equals mute and config.sfx mute equals mute and config.voices mute equals mute. Now for the audio mixers, there's no direct way that I know of that I've seen or researched where you can actually just toggle a mute setting like you can do from a audio source, but we can effectively mute it by changing the volume. Now since our volume is controlled by sliders, and we also want it to be controlled by the booleans here, we can just monitor and see what the boolean is to determine if we use the value of the slider or if we set it down to the very bottom of the barrel. So let's go ahead and check this out. Let's try to get the value. So let's say float volume equals, let's check if config.voices mute. If we have muted, then we're going to use the muted volume. So let's go to Audio Manager and add a public float or public constant float muted volume level. And that is going to equal -80. So if we have muted it, then we'll reference Audio Manager dot mute, so muted volume level. Otherwise, we're going to access the evaluated result of the audio curve based off of the slider value. So when we set the float, we'll set it based off the parameter to whatever the volume is. And we can go ahead and just copy this to the other ones, to sound effects, but make sure that we choose config.sfx volume and check for config.sfx mute. And for music, let's replace that line, config music mute and config.music volume. And make sure that I change the name of this parameter as well. So SFX volume parameter and music volume parameter. And that should go ahead and take care of it for us. But we're also going to want some sort of visible way to know whether we're muted or not. Otherwise, we're just going to be moving the slider around and we're not going to see anything. So when we set the music mute, let's also go ahead and change how the audio slider is represented. So we'll change its color, and we'll also go ahead and change the image that is displayed on the mute button to either be an audio symbol or a muted audio symbol. So let's say that I go ahead and mute the music. First of all, I want my slider to change to a different color. To do that, I want access to this fill object. This fill object on the slider, if we change that color to red, then it will show that it is red and there's basically no audio running through it. Or we could set that to a very dark color so we know that nothing's happening. Whereas with an active one, we could have it set to another color, maybe that orange color, just like it fits with our theme. but if it's muted, then it'll be gray. And we could also, in that matter, change the button here from using the music on icon to using the music off icon, so it shows that it's muted. For that, we're going to need access to the fill object and the images that we want to switch out this button for. To do this, in my UI item section, I can make two public static colors, which will be for the music on, and that will be a little orangish color, and a music off color, which will be that gray color. And then we can go ahead and access the slider. So we can say UI.sfxVolume.fillRect, which is basically our fill item, and we'll go ahead and get the component of the type image, grab the color off of that, and set that equal to a value, whether we are muted or whether we are not. So mute, let's evaluate that. If we are muted, then we'll access UI items.off color. Otherwise, UI items on color, as we are not muted. And we can go ahead and do the same thing for our music and our voices. Let's say UI music volume, get component image, mute, and yeah, that's the same for everything else. So all we need to do is change voices volume here, and we're good. Now to change the image from the on and off symbol, or the muted and unmuted symbol, let's go ahead and have a public sprite for the muted symbol and public sprite unmuted symbol. And we'll go back to the bottom where we set SFX mute, and we'll go ahead and say UI.mute. Oh, do we not have the button up there? I don't think we do. Yeah, so we just added the sliders, but not the buttons. So let's go ahead and add a public button for the music mute, public button for SFX mute, and public button for voices mute. Come all the way back down and say UI.musicMute.getComponent image dot sprite equals, let's evaluate if we are muted. If we are, then UI dot muted symbol, otherwise UI dot unmuted symbol. And we can set that for the rest of these just like we did for the slider color. Only change it to SFX mute and voices mute. But what I just realized is we're clicking a button and there's only one button. So we should toggle this rather than providing a set value like we did for the other buttons when they were in pairs. So let's get rid of mute, and I'm going to go ahead and just say that config.musicMute equals not config.musicMute. So we just toggle it. And config.sfxmute is equal to the opposite of what it currently is. Same for config.voicesMute. Set it to the opposite of what it currently is. And then we can just reference config music mute in the place of those values, config sfx mute in the place of that, and we've essentially got ourselves a toggle instead of a dedicated value passed in. If Visual Studio will play nice with me, I can get this done. There we go. Now, in addition to setting the volumes, we can do the mute status afterwards, because mute is going to be saved in the file, and the sliders will be able to see what the current status is immediately. And all we need to do is set the symbols for whether they are muted or not. So UI dot, let's see, music mute dot get component. Actually, that will not work just for getting the component, because some of these menus, including the audio menu, might start disabled. So we don't want to try to get any components if they're going to be disabled. Instead, since we really don't need a reference to the button, we can just replace that for an image, because all we need to do is set the sprite on it. We don't need to do anything with the button. So instead of getting the component of the image, we can just say musicmute.sprite equals the value, and sfxmute.sprite and voicesmute.sprite. That way we are storing it and we don't have to worry about any null references or issues like that. So musicmute.sprite equals music mute, if that's true, UI dot muted symbol, otherwise UI dot unmuted symbol, and we're going to make sure that we've got the right symbol showing at the right for the right config. So UI sfx mute and UI dot voices mute, depending on if it's sfx mute or if it is voices mute. Okay, so we should be able to see this work. To do that, we need to get the right references. So let's open our config menu, and you can see that we have the muted symbol, which needs to be set in here. So let me grab this muted icon and the unmuted icon, and then we just need the images for our buttons. So if we come down and look here in our SFX and voices and all that, we've got a button here which has the image component attached to it. So the music button is going to go right there, and the SFX button will be placed in the SFX group, and voices button right below that. Now let's go ahead and select all those buttons and add an on-click event which will access the config menu, access the config menu script, and then set music mute. Only for SFX, change that to set SFX mute, and for voices, change it to set voices mute. And so when we load that up, well, we'll see that we have the default colors for our sliders, but if we hit the mute button, we do get the music is muted. Now, where is the ambience coming from? Because that's still being shown somewhere. Oh, yeah, so might need to change the actual volume when we mute it. So first of all, when we set the slider value, it's not going to update the color because we're only doing that in the mute function. So let's just copy the line where we set the color and paste that into our set music volume area. Do the same thing for SFX. At the very end of the SFX volume, and for voices as well. Again, looking at this get component, that is a recipe for failure if the panel is disabled, especially since that's going to run on start and it might be disabled. So we should actually, for safeguarding reasons, have a reference to the fill rect inside of the UI elements. So even though we can get that right off the slider, there's no guarantee we'll be able to do that because it may not be active. So in addition to having this slider, let's also have a public image for the music fill, and public image for SFX fill, and public image for voices fill. And the more of these you have, the more it may benefit you to separate these into different subclasses. But right now we're still manageable, so I'm going to leave it as is, but we'll come down to the bottom where we set the volumes, and we'll go ahead and say that get rid of get component and say ui.musicfill.color equals whatever that is, and ui.sfx fill color equals the SFX color, and voices fill color equals that value. So we should get the colors applying, and now we just need to set the volume based off of if we click mute or not. So if we do hit mute, then really all we need to do is just grab this section where we set the float, which means we'll just want a reference to the audio mixer, and we'll want a reference to where we set the volume. So we get the mixer as the music mixer and music parameter name, and then reference our volume, which is going to be the audio manager dot muted volume level. let's copy that, add that to our mute button and to our mute voices button. So change that for SFX mixer, mixer dot, yeah, that's the same, dot SFX parameter, and then mixer equals voices mixer, set float of voices parameter to the muted level. Now everything should work. And all we need to do is add the links to the slider fill images. So for music, I'll take the fill, and then for SFX, I'll grab its fill image, pop that in there, and for voices, grab that last fill image and throw that in there as well. So now let's go ahead and start, and we should get colors immediately, and we should be able to change the colors and the volume based off of config. Which it is. So they're all muted. If I unmute, then we're looking good there. Which it's... Oh, you know what? I was stupid. Why am I going to set the volume to be muted no matter what if we're toggling it to where it's not muted anymore? So you know what? Basically, that just means we're going to reuse all of this, which means we can extract this into a different function. So let's do that. Let's make this a private... Maybe we can even do this through the audio manager itself. As a matter of fact, I think we'll go ahead and extract all of this, cut that out, and head to our audio manager where we will set the volume of a mixer. For simplicity, let's make a new void called setMusicVolume, which will take the volume and the boolean for whether it's muted or not. And then we'll go ahead and change the volume to whether it's muted as the muted level, which would be -80, and if it's not, we'll convert the normalized value into the actual value that would be applied to the mixer, and then apply that to our mixer. So we'll copy this and go ahead and run that for set SFX volume as well, and then just make sure we use the SFX mixer and the SFX volume parameter name, and the same for voices. So voices volume and muted equals, yep, so voices volume, voices mixer, set float, voices volume parameter name. And then what we can do quite easily is simplify this logic in all of our set volumes. So let's go to music, just take out all 4 of these lines where we go and set the music volume, and instead call audio manager.instance.setMusicVolume, and we'll set it to the config.musicVolume and check config.musicMute. And that's basically all we'll need to do, so we can change 4 lines into 1 for all of these and make it a little easier. So set SFX volume to config SFX volume, looking at config SFX mute. Same for voices, paste it in, set voices volume, config voices, and voices mute. And then we'll just go ahead and take these values and paste them into these other commands as well, so we are reusing logic without making it messy. And now what happens is we can click mute, and it mutes. We can raise up the volume, mute it, unmute, and we've got everything working. So there we are, a little bit of a backtrack there, but now we've got both of our audio and our general tabs working in the config menu. And that sets us up well for being able to configure this visual novel, have the user be able to change their settings. And the next thing that we'll work on is we'll get our main menu working and make it where we can load up from a brand new visual novel state and take care of everything directly from a main menu that introduces the player to our novel. So I'll see you guys in that one. Bye.